be more significant research done, especially in these very complex, multiple kinds of stressors. I think we need to be looking at the ways in which we can both sort of individually as family members of people in these situations, as community members of people in these situations, understand how we can be providing help and support, sort of taking away that notion. I talked about it a bit in the piece that, I think a lot of people want to see parents like us as superheroes.
Yes.
And they tell us, we try to talk about what's so difficult, and people say, well, you're just stronger than other people. And then
I don't know how you do it.
Yeah. I don't know how you do it. God only gives, special kids to special parents. And none of that is true. I mean, yes, we're strong. Yes,
but what's the choice?
But there is no choice.
Right.
We're all just regular humans who are dealing with, extreme scenarios. And what we need is for people to listen to us and not decide to turn the other way because it's too startling to
hear,
to embrace the fact that we're just regular people who are going through something that's incredibly difficult, and that we run the risk of breaking under the pressure. And I think the pressure on caregivers at this juncture is so high that we're not just being told that we're superheroes. We're expected to provide exceptional care for our children, oftentimes with very, very little nursing, medical
resources,
practitioner, or family support. And then we're also all being told that we're to be a part of the research and clinical and legislative solutions to help keep our children safe. And under that weight, we are, we're incredibly stressed.
Yeah. To be asked to participate in study after study and give your opinion on this and that, and and there's nothing lucrative in it. It's just
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so much of what's happening clinically and from a research perspective is all hinging on the work being done by parent-led advocacy organizations who are working for free and under very limiting situations, but they're doing it because they want to help their children. And that's
right.
It's a beautiful thing, but it is also not entirely sustainable.
It's not sustainable. That's what I was just thinking that as you said. This can't keep going on.
Yeah. So I think that the reality is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think that there are ways, I see views onto ways to help that are surprising. For instance, conversations that I've had with vets, and some really interesting overlap in these populations. I think there's some really exceptional opportunities for these two communities to work together and help each other. But I absolutely want to also shift the onus onto the institutions and organizations that serve these populations to say, I have often felt like when I've tried to talk to, whether it's medical institutions or educational institutions or organizations that provide services for rare disease communities, to say, hey, you need to be aware of the mental health of the parents, and you need to understand that the way that you conduct yourself has implications on their ability to respond to you and to participate. I've often felt that what the reception I've gotten up until this point has been a bit of the professional equivalent of like a pat on the shoulder and here's the door.
Yeah. Or I've gotten dead silence almost.
Yes. And, I think that the reality is that these are institutions that are ostensibly there to serve these populations, and they need to understand the intricacies and they need to make the effort to understand the intricacies of these communities that they're interacting with, and not, I sort of had the sense that in a weird way, this was a rock that like no one wanted me to turn over, because it's too disturbing to think
volatile.
About. Right. And it's essentially is this rock that's covering a sinkhole of stress.
Because no one really knows how to manage it yet.
No one knows how to manage it. And when we say no one knows how to manage it, we mean everyone from the immediate families of a lot of these parents. And, a lot of this wasn't published, and I can speak to it in sort of general terms, but really stressful relationships with among these moms, with their siblings, with their parents, with their in-laws. And, people who are not understanding the depth of the stress, and also not understanding the reactions that they receive when you interact with someone who has just come home from an active war zone. You expect to have reactions to your interactions with them that may not be what are typical. But I think people forget that when you're interacting with moms and dads and caregivers in this population, you also might receive responses that are not typical. So, another characteristic of PTSD is inappropriate emotional response. And, I know for myself, I can say I anger more easily than is always reasonable. I can remain calm through all sorts of stuff. But if someone is 5 minutes late to my house, I might blow a gasket.
Like you can walk through the fire with Esmé and these medical appointments and everything else, but yeah.
And part of that is misunderstood intricacies of even sustaining lives like these. So, my life runs on 5 to 15 minute increments, and we have windows that drugs have to be given, and that naps have to be started, and that, feeds have to begin. Because if you get off schedule, it's not just frustrating like it is maybe with another kid who might get grumpy and, be difficult for the rest of the evening. It's actually a health concern.
It's like it can be a threat to their health. Yes.
And so I think the onus, again, I really want to encourage, people who are either in the medical field or working in organizations that support these populations, or that are the friends and families and neighbors of people who are going through these kinds of trials, to understand that it isn't actually it shouldn't be the responsibility of the person who is dealing with the challenge to say, oh, this is what I need and this is how you can help me.
Yeah, you don't even can't even put that into words when you're in the trenches of this type of care.
I need you to understand that I may get upset when, because it's even for myself, and I tend to try to be reflective about these things. It's taken me years to understand why I react certain ways to certain things, and why I, hear certain sounds and I'm suddenly sweaty and angry. And
it wasn't really till, I don't mean to cut you off, but I just have to share that. It wasn't until my oldest daughter, who has tuberous sclerosis and on the autism spectrum, moved out to I couldn't care for her anymore in the home. She ended up in shared living, which is awesome. But, when she moved out, I realized that all the work that had been like I was kind of the scaffolding for the whole operation. And it was all of a sudden she moved out, and I felt like there was this huge well of just stuff that I threw myself into, like you said, I threw myself into volunteer projects and advocacy. And so, it wasn't until things kind of calmed down just a little bit that I could even look at it. And I'm wondering if there's a lot, I am sure that that's a lot of people's experience. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's,
they just don't want to take the time. I mean, for me to think about managing my own psychological care when I needed to be on to address, my kid having a seizure at school or whatever I could do it. I couldn't go to a shrink and talk about this stuff because I had to keep my crap together.
Right. And I think that's a very common experience, like that people can seem, somewhat flat and, or inaccessible emotionally because they are holding themselves so tightly, because if something cracks, we're going to have a problem. And I'm a crier. I've always been someone who cries relatively easily. And for many years, I had this experience where I would start crying and it would just sort of truncate. Like it was never I never felt like I was done crying. I just would cry for a second and then it would stop. And I remember saying to my mom a couple years into life with Ez and saying, I think my body's afraid that if I start crying, I will never ever stop.
Yeah.
That was, for me had always been a really good coping mechanism. When I would get upset, I'd cry for a few minutes and I'd feel better, but it never worked that way with this experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I can fully relate to that. In fact, my daughter, my 20-year-old, she started having seizures after not having them for like 20 years. And I get a call that her program manager is on the way to the hospital with her because she just had a seizure. And like, I was right back. And I sat there and I just burst into tears for a good solid 5 minutes. And then I'm like, okay, that's not what's going to happen right now. I'm just going to step out of that little loop and react to what is actually happening. But yeah, so.
You have to get to work.
You have to get to work.
And in some ways, I think a lot of people get more comfortable in those situations than they are in the periods of things being relatively good. Because, and that's,
that
maybe why you have to keep busy. Yeah.
Yes, I will share that I fell into, I fell into a lot of alcoholism and, prescribed a lot of meds, and I feel like I wasn't in touch with the experience. It's almost like you have to be in touch with the experience and this is probably the whole premise of your art, to care, but then, so there's you can get too numbed out or be too triggered all the time. It's a thin line, and I know you know that. And so I think you've really given a lot of important and groundbreaking information through the course of talking to you. I could probably talk to you for 3 more hours, and you could be my therapist, and but for time's sake, I'm just looking through my questions here. I think we've kind of hit them all in some ways. So positive gains, and I think your suggestion of the caregivers standing up and being willing to say, hey, this is valid, what I have, what I'm coping with, what should the conversation be? Say, for instance, we're at our appointment with our child and talking to our doctor, and do you have any suggestions as far as that?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. One is that I think there is also a really fine line between being honest and real about what we're experiencing and also being protective of our children. And I think one of the reasons people struggle to talk about this is that there's a fear that other people will see us as seeing our children as burdens, and or that we wouldn't choose this path again. And I think people are protective of their children around those issues.
Yes.
And I think they should be. I think that, there's a potential to sort of lean into a kind of ableist, oh, pity me because I have this child who's,
victim mentality.
Not well. I think it's really important to, again, there's a very fine line there. And there's a tightrope to walk where you say, no, my child is perfect. Esmé is perfect. I would not change anything about her, except that it's really difficult to be her mom, and also it's really difficult to be Esmé.
Yes, and in this world.
How do you hold those two things at the same time to be true? And how do you try to help her and help yourself? And I think one piece that I think is incredibly important is being cognizant of our children in these discussions. Having some of the discussions in front of your children, if that's appropriate. I think, I have these things in front of Esmé. We always have to remember, especially those of us who have children who are nonverbal, tense, and to recognize that, just because your child can't respond or ask questions or insert themselves into this conversation, that they are listening to whatever their capacity.
Right.
And that we also don't want to harm them in trying to seek our own solutions.
And that's another reason that this whole topic needs to be explored and
very carefully.
Very carefully.
Very, very carefully.
That's a really good point.
So I think